Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, the hero will be the rook. As we know, the rook is the second most valuable piece in chess next to the queen. And in this lesson, we learn about different checkmating ideas with the rook. The rook is a linear piece. That is, the rook is most effective in open files. Obviously, to checkmate the opponent's king, the file needs to be open. That means there needs to be nothing in between the king and the rook. Well, let's get started with our very first example. Here we go. Well, in this position, even by just glancing at it, we can tell that black has major material advantage, still having his queen, and both rooks. White has only one rook, no queen, and has two bishops and a knight. Black also has two extra pawns. So just by the material count, black should be winning easily. Also, the black king seems to be pretty safe in the corner, hidden with its two pawns in front of it on a7 and b7, guarding it safely. Or at least, so it seems. One of the important aspects to recognize is that white has a bishop on f4, and that bishop controls the only square the black king could potentially move to on b8. So, therefore, if we could attack the king without that piece that attacks the king being captured, that would be checkmate. The challenge is right now that if white would choose to attack the king right away, for example with knight c7, it's true the knight cannot be captured, but by moving the knight precisely to this square, c7, it blocks away the white bishop's power to the b8 square, and the black king can simply move out of the check. And then, when the knight, let's say, would check the king again by a discovery attack to the king would even have a choice to move back to the corner, or rather to move to c8 and walk out of any of the dangers that we'll see that the king is facing. By the way, another thing to definitely recognize is always we need to know what does our opponent want to do, especially if that is something very immediate and very dangerous. Well, first of all, we need to check if is our own king in any immediate danger. And in this case, we can see that black has doubled up on the H file with the rook and the queen, and the black queen is threatening to come down to H2, attacking the king and checkmate. In addition, the white knight on D5 is also under attack by black's pawn on E6. So the knight C7 check does not quite accomplish what we'd like it to do. Well, I have another idea. How about moving the rook to A1, and that would threaten on the following move to move the knight to B6, which indeed would be a checkmate, because then the A7 pawn would be pinned, therefore would not be allowed to capture the white knight on B6, because it would leave the black king in attack. The problem now is that black could simply capture the knight before that knight would give the checkmate. Let's go back again. Another thing that's important to recognize is that if black would not have the pawn on A7, that would open up the A file for white to move the rook to A1 and checkmate. But how could we get rid of that A7 pawn? Well, obviously, stealing it simply off the board is not a solution. However, white has a very effective move that doesn't give black a choice but to move that pawn away from the a7 square. And that brilliant move is to move the knight to b6. Now, black has no choice. The black king is under attack. It cannot move out of the check because of white's bishop. And therefore, only move is to capture back. And now, voila, here comes the checkmate. It's a very common tactic that you can try to play for and trick your opponent. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Naturally, in this position, white has many ways to win the game. In fact, any of the moves would still give white a winning advantage. However, I'd like to show you what's the move that wins the game the quickest. White actually has a way to checkmate in just 2 moves in this position. Making one move, black makes a response to that, and the second white move to be a checkmate. Naturally, in this position, white has many ways to win. In fact, any of the possible moves would maintain the winning advantage. However, the question is, how can white win the game the quickest? In fact, there is a way to win in only 2 moves, that is to checkmate. Make one move, black makes a response to that, and the second white move ends the game. Well, as I mentioned in some of the previous lessons, when you're trying to checkmate a king, the most important thing you need to do is to take away all the squares, if you can, that the king is able to move to at the moment. So right now, the black king is able to move to these 3 highlighted with green squares. The white rook obviously cannot take away all 3 of them. However, if the black king indeed manages to escape, for example, to c7, it's clear that it's impossible to checkmate the king there. As we know, a king can only be checkmated by a rook and king if that king is all the way down to the edge of the board at the 8th rank, 1st rank, A or H files. So therefore, we definitely need to restrict the king from getting there. Would king d6 solve that problem? Well, not quite. It would solve the problem as of the black king escaping on c7, and in fact, this move would threaten with checkmate with rook g8. However, the black king would just walk away actually in either direction, and then this rook check is not a checkmate because the king again escapes. So let's go back again to the starting position and let me show you what is the correct approach. And that is to move our rook to c4. Now this is one of those situations when the actual move did not create a threat. It was simply restricting the opponent, the escape of the king. And on top of it, black now is in a very unfortunate situation that the king needs to move. Black has no choice, cannot say, I pass, like in some other games. In chess, whenever it's your turn, you need to make a move. And at that, black has only one legal move, only one option. And after that move, king to e8, white is ready to checkmate with rook c8, and black has no escape. Let's move on to a bit more complex situation. Here we go. Well, this is one of the most basic back-rank checkmate situations. However, for an inexperienced player, it may seem that while white has a rook threatening the c8 square, so does black have a rook threatening or attacking or defending the c8 square. Now, this is the trick. This is almost like an X-ray situation that white has a second rook behind the first one that can back it up, so to say. So right now, it's white to move, and white, by moving the rook to c8, white gives a check, not yet a checkmate. It's true that the black rook can capture the white rook, but then on the second move, rook takes rook indeed gives checkmate. That's why it's very important in such situations to try to prevent that. If you would play a bit black here, for example, which black could accomplish by moving one of the 3 pawns up and giving an escape route for the black king. Let's move on to a very nice little combination. Here we go. This is another tricky position where black is a pawn up. In addition to that, black is right away attacking the white bishop on e2 with the rook, and moreover, that rook is pinning the bishop too. The bishop is not allowed to move away. If it could, the bishop could move to c4, attacking the black king, which could be very deadly. But the bishop is pinned, it cannot move. So the question is, what should white do? Remember, our hero in this lesson is the rook. For example, if white would be moving the rook from f1 to h1, trying to double up, and then to checkmate in the corner, true, that's a threat. The problem is that black would get time to defend against it, starting with simply capturing the bishop with a check, and then, for example, giving another check and trading rooks, and then all of black's worries would be gone. Going back to the starting position, let's examine for a moment what would happen after rook takes rook. King takes back, and white, let's say, giving another check, nothing would really happen, the king simply escapes. Not the solution again. I'd like to share with you here a beautiful pattern that white has at his disposal. And that is to make a decoy and give away one of the rooks in order to force the black king into the corner and away from his rook on f8. After king takes rook, rook takes the other rook on f8 and checkmate. Very pretty. Let's see our next example. Here we go. This one is a little similar to the very last example. In this position, black has 4 pawns while white only 2. That's 2 extra pawns for black. Also, black has just moved the queen to g6, offering the exchange of queens as well as to capture a pawn on g3 with a major devastating attack. What should white do? Well, one thing I can tell you for sure not to do, and that is to trade queens. About 99% of the time, when you are down material, whether it's 2 pawns or more, you typically do not want to exchange pieces, especially not the queens. The queen is the most dangerous piece when it comes to attack. Now, even though I just said that, sometimes we don't mind to give up even our most treasured, valuable piece, the queen, if that will result in checkmate. Amazingly, white has a beautiful queen sacrifice with queen f8. After king takes, the king got forced onto an unfortunate square where now the rook can attack it, and the king has no escape because the bishop from b2 controls the g7 square. The only way to delay the checkmate is by blocking the check and then simply rook takes rook, checkmate. Let's move on. Here we go. In this 4-rook endgame, black is a pawn ahead. It's very crucial that it is white's turn. White again can force checkmate in just a couple of moves. Now it would be too slow for white to play rook d1, which would be a logical move, trying to take away escape squares from the black king. Because then black would come first by giving a check. Now if the white king moves, the white rook on a2 would become history. Or after rook takes, with only one rook, black has solved all his checkmate related problems and would simply have a clearly better position with an extra pawn. White needs both rooks in order to try to create serious danger for black. The correct order to achieve that is to use the other rook first, make a forceful move. The king escapes to d7 and only then to use the second rook with rook d1. Now the black king already has no escape. The only move is to block the check, and then again we not only capture the rook, but it's a checkmate. Very nice example again. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. This looks like a simple endgame where black is the one playing for a win, having again material advantage. At first it seems that since the white bishop is under attack and so is the white pawn on e6, white should be playing e7, protecting both at the same time. However, that's not the best move. Even though white now threatens to promote the pawn, black can stop that plan. Instead, white can actually checkmate in just 2 moves. To achieve that, white would play check, king g6, and a very artistic checkmate with rook to h6. White is optimally using all his pieces to create this very elegant checkmate. All of the white 4 pieces are cooperating very ideally, with the pawn taking away the f7 square, the bishop protecting the rook and controlling g7, the king controlling f5, g5, and then the rook, through an x-ray, controls the f6 square and of course h5. Very nice checkmate. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, it is white's turn, and again, black seems to have an okay position. Moreover, the white bishop is pinned. The first idea would have been otherwise. The white bishop to move to h7 to attack the black king, force it away to the corner, and then rook takes knight on f8. However, the bishop is pinned. It cannot move because otherwise that would leave the king in an attack. So in this position, it's white's turn, cannot move the bishop, period. White needs to look for something different. And this largely resembles one of our earlier positions from this lesson. In fact, it resembles position number 4. White again gives up one rook to create checkmate by forcing the opponent's king to an unfortunate position. And that move is rook to h8. King captures, and now rook takes knight, and the black king has no way out. Let's move on. Here we go. This position, for a change, it is black's turn. If you look at the material balance, you'll see that white has an extra rook. Well, that's a huge advantage. In addition, white has immediate threats in capturing black's pawn with a check. Therefore, making a move like rook a7 would clearly be too slow because white would respond with an immediate attack by capturing the pawn. Another very common and typical pattern I'd like to share with you, by opening the A file a bit similarly to the very first example of this lesson. And now, after king takes, the rook swings over to checkmate. Pay attention to the pawn being an important part of this puzzle, making sure the king doesn't run away on b3. Let's move on. In this position, we're going back again to a pattern we discussed already earlier when we're talking about a back rank problem. White made a careless move, last move, moving the queen to f4, creating an immediate threat in capturing the pawn on c7 with checkmate. However, it allows black to sacrifice the queen, check the white king, rook takes, and again, just like in our third example, here we go, the X-ray pattern. When there are two linear pieces lined up on the same line, the one that's behind is also an active participant. As we could see here, black again achieved checkmate. The next example is one of the most typical patterns when two rooks are extremely powerful on the 7th rank. The reason why it's important that it is the 7th rank is that the black king is on the 8th rank, and the fact that there is no 9th rank. What that means is that the limitation of the chessboard helps white. What happens here is white would give a check using one rook to take away the h8 square from the king, and then use the second rook to actually deliver checkmate. As you can see, the limitation of the chessboard disallows black to move up to the 9th rank, which doesn't exist, and the rook on f8 doesn't allow the king to move there, and the two white rooks, of course, cover everything else. And our very last example in this lesson, here we go. Here again, black has the material advantage, having still his queen and one extra pawn. And again, what I'd like to stress that it's important to play aggressively, because making a quiet move that would threaten to checkmate in the corner would be too slow. It would give black the opportunity to, first of all, if they wish, to simply create an escape route for the king. But of course, there is even a better move, namely to give a check with the queen on c6, and it's a fork at the same time, attacking both the king and the rook. So what should white do? Well, white should give a check. The check in itself is not a success. However, in this case it is, because it forces the black king to move out of it, and then a similar idea, the rook check from h8, indeed is checkmate. Well, I hope you respect the rook a bit more after this lesson, and you gain some ideas on how to checkmate your opponent with rooks. Thank you for listening, and so long until next time.